Hello, everybody. Um, I want to talk to all of you who call yourselves followers of Christ. Um, Especially through this quarantine, life is tough. Most importantly, though, faith is tough, and I have found that it's really hard to live every moment of every day, um, trusting in God. It's hard not to fall back into old patterns of sin. It's hard to be a man or woman after God's heart. And this is something I really struggled with in the past couple weeks. Is living consistently for God. I've found myself kind of going up and down, riding this roller coaster of faith, where some days I'll just be feeling really close to God, feeling really intimate and like things are great. And then the next day would be like falling flat on my face, falling back into sin and just feeling so distant from Him. And I think one of the biggest problems I'm finding is not just that roller coaster ride, is also after those moments of failure or after those moments of doubt or inconsistency, I'm finding it hard to come back to God full of passion and joy. If you're like me, when you mess up, or if you have days of doubts, or you lose passion, it's almost like we're afraid to come back to God. We're afraid that He's going to see our full rebellion for what it is. He's going to see our hearts and how messed up and jacked up they really are. And I'm not talking about here like losing salvation, because I don't believe you can lose your salvation. I know that's secure, but what I'm talking about is just different levels of intimacy with Him, where you're you feel closer whether or not. Because I know that no matter what, He's never going to abandon me. But for some reason, after moments of failure or doubt, I find it hard to trust, the one I'm supposed to trust. I have trouble fully grasping, the deepness of His mercy. I feel like in my mind, it's like, oh, it's going to run dry today, or His grace is not going to extend this far, or His love for me is going to be lacking today, and I'm going to have to earn it back. Even though, I'm the unfaithful one, even though God has never shown Him to be faithful, I find myself struggling with this up and down, and most specifically after the down, coming back to Him with the bandit, just running to Him. I find myself, more like slowly creeping up, like, are we good? Are we good? And consistently He's saying, yes, come to me. But if you're like me, you've struggled with the same thing, especially through this quarantine. And I want to offer some encouragement to you today. I think the story of David is probably one of the most fascinating stories in the Bible. I love it because it's so real, it's raw. Nowhere does it pretend that David's perfect. It does say he's a man after God's own heart, which is a great thing to pattern your life after, but he is by no means perfect. One day he deals the same stuff we are. One day he's on top of the world and he's conquering Goliath, this monumental faith victory in his life. And the next day, like, he's being threatened by King Saul and he's running for his life and he's like not trusting God at all. And you see the same ups and downs in his life. And you can see just how God is so faithful and constantly pursuing him and beckoning David back to Him. But I want to look at a story in 1 Samuel 21 that talks exactly about what we're talking about and what I've been going through. So if you'll read it with me, I'm not gonna read the whole thing. I was going to encourage you guys to read the chapters on your own. I do encourage you to do that because they're so full of life, so real. But in 1 Samuel 21, just to give you some context, about a few chapters ago, David had just defeated Goliath, which is, again, this monumental victory in his life. He has been named king of Israel by the prophet Samuel. But the key distinction here is at this point, he is not actually the king. He is not recognized as king by the people, or more importantly, by the current king, who is Saul. So Saul is still operating as king, but in God's eyes, David is king. And obviously, Saul does not want to give up his seat. And he has been told that he has been rejected by God. So you can imagine kind of what that would be like for Saul. And of course, he wanted nothing to do with that information, and he sought to kill David. And so David at this point in his life, he's being chased by an unstable, mentally kind of psychotic king who wants to destroy him. Because at this point in Saul's life, he's kind of going a little crazy. His attitude and his demeanor change constantly. One minute he's like, he loves David. Another minute he's trying to kill him with a spear. So David's like freaking out. And here's where everything starts going bad for David as he's in this new season of his life. And instead of trusting in God, like you would expect him to do, like he did through the whole story of Goliath, instead of leaning on God, he runs away from Saul. He runs for his life. He becomes a fugitive. He travels to a town called Nob, where he runs into a priest that can tell something is wrong because David's acting weird. He's not fully trusting in God, and obviously this priest can tell. And more importantly, there's another man there in this town who is a faithful servant of Saul. So David goes to this town and he sees these two people and he's like, oh shoot, they're going to know who I am. They're going to tell Saul. Saul's going to come here and kill me. So he lies. He makes up these cover stories that are completely not true, which is, the first of his sins. As he's no longer trusting in God with his life, he begins trying to fix things himself. And so he falls deeper and deeper into sin, starting with lying. And the interesting thing about this place, and here's where just the real emotional, this is a real person. You can really see his humanity here. This is the place that David stored the sword of Goliath after he killed him. In the story here, he convinces the priest to give it back to him. And if you think about this sword was like a symbol for David of his faith. This was a symbol of his great victory, with probably the most incredible faith victory of his life, where God used him in front of thousands of people, as a symbol of his trust in God. And I'm sure that at this point in David's life, he's like, I'm just panicking. And he's remembering, okay, I remember back when I used to walk so close to God, when I trusted in him. I want that back. And so his mind connects that faith and the sword. He's like, if I just get that sword back, then I'll trust in God. Things will be great again. And he comes and gets the sword. And he's not really trusting in God. He's just trying to get the good old days back. And he gets the sword and realizes it's really just a very big sword. The true power was the intimacy with God, not the sword. We've all been there. The same place that David is, where we wander from God, we find ourselves in sin, and we look back and we're like, how did I get here? And we think, I remember when life was so sweet with God before. Why did I leave that? Why did I wander? And a lot of us try to make that happen again. We wander, trying to figure out, how can I get that back? But like David, a lot of us, we don't turn to God right away when that's the one thing we left. That's the reason we're in this situation. We don't turn to God because we're afraid of God. We're afraid that he's going to see our heart. We're afraid, I don't know what we're afraid of, but what happens is we end up turning farther and farther away from God, and we fall deeper and deeper into sin. And that's exactly what David does in 1 Samuel 21. After he leaves Nob, at the end of this chapter, David flees to a place called Gath, which this is an insane move by David. Gath was the hometown of Goliath. So think about this. This was a place of pagans. They were not worshipers of David's God here. These are people who are enemies of Israel. They are definitely enemies of David. I guarantee they despise him. Think about, David is the one who, in front of all of them, killed their champion and embarrassed their nation. Can you imagine how these people, David is probably their number one most hated person in their entire nation. and that's where he chooses to go. I guarantee every person in that nation wanted to get revenge on David. So why would he go there? But the question we need to ask us is, why do we do the same thing? Why would David go to the worst place he could possibly go on earth? But we do the exact same thing. When we flee from God, when we're trusting in ourselves and not in God, we flee to the very sin that God saved us from. God saved him from the Philistines, from the people of Gath, and that's where David retreated to when he was running from God, not trusting in him. We do the exact same thing. When we turn from God, we find ourselves falling deeper and deeper in sin because we're not trusting in him. And our shame and our guilt of turning from the intimacy of God causes us to lose it even further. So we're guilty about turning from God, and so we pull farther and farther away, and we just get caught in this cycle, and we wonder, how did I get here? But unfortunately for David, in this story, it actually gets worse. So of course David's identified because everybody knows his face. So he's captured by the people of Gath. He's taken prisoner by the king. So now David's literally physically stuck. He's in prison by the king. He's unable to do anything to fix his situation. He's reached rock bottom where God's like, you can't get yourself out of here. In this moment of desperation, obviously, he turns to God. And here's what really made this story come alive to me. I have never before had connected, the Psalms of David with his life. I've never actually read a story and then found a psalm and said, okay, what did you write in this moment? But there's so many, I've noticed this week, I've been looking through, there's so many psalms that David wrote in a specific moment, and it tells us where he wrote it or when he wrote it. And there are actually 3 psalms that he wrote basically about this time period. And the first one he wrote is Psalm 56. When he is captured by the king of Gath. He wrote Psalm 56. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I encourage you to read it, and you can see David's heart and kind of his mental process and what God is doing on his heart as he's experiencing this. But I just want to look at just 4 small verses in here because it shows his heart so clearly. Most importantly, his renewed faith in God. It says this: you have kept count of my tossings. You have put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? Then my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. This I know, this is my favorite part, this I know, that God is for me. In God, whose word I praise, in the Lord, whose word I praise, in God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? See, this psalm, there's no pretending here that he didn't sin or that his life was falling apart. Like, he embraced it. He's like, yeah, I screwed up. You see it all. You see my heart. It's all before you. Yet at the same time, he embraces the truth that God is for me. He didn't shy away. He's finally stopped running from that truth, and he's embraced it. And he saw that the biggest mistake that he made was his sin of not trusting in God. It wasn't his lie to the priest. It wasn't trusting in the sword. It wasn't going to Gath, even though that was a very brainless, stupid thing to do. His problem was that he didn't trust in God. Everything stemmed from that problem. It prevented him from experiencing that intimacy with God and having it restored to him. Same with us. When we turn from God, when we run from him, it prevents that intimacy, that lack of trust. Intimacy requires trust. And here's the cool part. David wrote another psalm from this story in his life. He wrote Psalm 34. Oh, I love this song. Please go read this psalm. But after David humbles himself and returns to God in the prison, God saves him, of course, right? And it's kind of funny how God does it. Back in 1 Samuel, it tells us that David pretends to be insane, and he acts crazy, and so the king sends him away. He's like, I don't want you crazy. I have enough crazy people in my nation. So I don't want this one too. So they think he's lost his mind, so like, just get him out of here. It's ironic, that David sought the strength of Goliath's sword to save him. And God used probably the most humbling and humiliating method possible to actually save him. That David lost his sanity. It made it so that David would not trust in his own strength. So, Psalm 34 is probably one of the most beautiful Psalms. One of the main themes of the Psalm is the idea of God saving those who humble themselves before God. So please go read it. It's amazing. It's inspiring. But it ends with this verse. This is how we're going to end this message. It says, "The Lord redeems the life of his servants. None of those who take refuge in him will be condemned." So if you find yourself, especially during this time of quarantine, you find your faith in God, your trust in him going up and down, you find yourself fleeing from God, not trusting him. You find yourself trying to hide in the darkness or fleeing from God like David did, afraid to come near to God, afraid that he may not love you or that he can't, he's going to not accept you. Let this verse be a reminder to you that God's mercy is abundant. And he wants to comfort you. He wants to restore you. He wants that intimacy restored with you, just like he did with David. But it takes that humbling of your heart, telling God, "Father, forgive me for not trusting you, for trusting in my own heart, for sinning against you. But I know that you are for me. And Lord, I want to take my refuge in you." So hope this encourages all of you, especially those of you who've experienced these ups and downs like I have. But I want to encourage you again, trust in the Lord. I'll just say this: the Lord redeems the life of his servants. None of those who take refuge in him will be condemned. Can't say it any better. Love you guys.